but we're going to probably center a lot of it in terms of the West and its relationship with the notion of freedom of speech, the rights to protest, the right to be able to stand up for those who are perhaps the most oppressed in our own societies and around the world.
When we look at what's happened since 9/11, there's been at least a dozen pieces of legislation enacted in the UK, culminating most recently in the Police Act in 2022 and the Public Order Act in 2023, which give a free hand basically to police on the beat right up to the appropriate minister to impose all kinds of restrictions on protests, the effect of which is essentially to mean that whatever you are permitted to do is not in any way a protest.
If you say something now which is towards the support of the oppressed, it could come on your Facebook, on your social media, and that could be reported. It could go to your workplace, and that could actually affect your own income. Is it scaring people? Is it preventing them from saying things, and are they self-censoring?
I came to a protest, and I didn't hear it myself, but other activists heard it. A Zionist passed by and said, "Death to the Arabs." The police heard it and refused to take any action. But on the other hand, if we say any criticism, including myself, I was arrested as well, just at the say-so of a Zionist with completely legitimate criticism of Israel, they say that the police immediately arrest these people.
Why would a man who is the leader of Al-Qaeda at one stage, or a very prominent leader amongst the Al-Qaeda fraternity, then becomes the leader of HTS in Syria, but is still holding the same old Al-Qaeda viewpoints? Al-Qaeda, which is prescribed as a terrorist organization by all the same governments who we are citizens of here in the West, and yet now we're seeing that that's legitimized.
I would observe that the real terrorism throughout that period has in fact been mostly carried out by the Atlantic World Security apparatus led by the United States, who've quietly financed and trained and armed up all manner of extremist groups and then publicly claimed to be opposing and fighting them.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we showcase countercultural, counter-political narratives and try to get to the real heart of the matter. Too often people are given symptoms of problems in geopolitics and current affairs, and what we're left with is no context and very little in terms of solutions. Well, we're going to try and rectify that situation in this ongoing series of podcasts, and today's topic is one which actually is vital, I think, globally, to be honest, but we're going to probably center a lot of it in terms of the West and its relationship with the notion of freedom of speech, the rights to protest, the right to be able to stand up for those who are perhaps the most oppressed in our own societies and around the world. So with this regard, there's no cause which is, I guess, more highlighted and more globally known now than the Palestinian one, and what's gone on in Gaza over the last year and a half or so clearly has shocked the world, and the powerlessness of people even to be able to demonstrate and simply be able to go onto the streets and say something against this is becoming more and more evident, because many people who are protesting are being picked up by the police under increasingly draconian laws which show very little regard for the so-called human rights and the so-called rights of freedom, which the West particularly does it does harp on a lot about it, awfully a lot to the Eastern world, yet we're seeing the reduction of that to the point where arbitrary arrests, violence, brutality by the police in Germany, in Britain, in America, we've seen it all played out. Students across campuses have got the treatment. Elderly Jews who are totally against the idea of genocide have also been targeted. And where is this all leading to is the question that comes to mind. And in the studio, I've got some fantastic contributions that I'm looking forward to. Yael is with us, an activist, an Israeli in terms of her origin, and very much somebody who's on the forefront of trying to fight for the justice of Palestinians and beyond. Yael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Very nice of you to join us. And online, of course, we have Barry Grossman, lawyer and a keen commentator on legislative issues around the world, because the global issues around the ICC and the ICJ have also come very, very clearly into focus, very much so over Gaza and Palestine over the last year as well. So it'd be very fascinating to see globally how legislature and how the legal side of things is shaping up for the world, a world in which increasingly it seems the powerful and the elitists want more and more of that power at the expense of ordinary people. Yael, I'm going to start with you, because there's a human element to all this. We can talk about the legislature and the legal side of it all night, but at the end of the day, let's just talk about, first of all, those who are protesting in the West. It was a right that we took for granted, one of our freedoms which was just normal. What I've seen unfold over the last year and a half or so is very, very, very worrying in terms of the way the police have been handling protesters and the rights of protesters themselves, based on legislation which has been pushed through Parliament steadily since the so-called war on terror. Some might call it the war of terror. But how is the war of terror or war on terror affected ordinary people's rights in Britain to start with?
I think we also need to see in the wider context. It's not just the legislation directly, and it's not just the police directly. It's not just the court, but it's actually every institution at every level, including if it is the management of hospital, which are putting at risk people who dare to say anything against the genocide. So I get friends in various hospitals saying how they've been punished, not only since the genocide of Gaza, but actually for some years. But of course now it's all escalating massively. And especially since Starmer became Prime Minister, the Starmer regime has proved to be extremely oppressive, very, very dictatorial. They use the anti-terrorism legislation to oppress people who try to take action to stop the genocide in the most horrific ways. It's not just the arrest, it's not just smashing the homes, even smashing, like in the case of Sarah Wilkinson, smashing the urn with spilling the ashes of her mother. I mean, this sort of behavior is more like what we know of the Israeli terrorism in for example, the West Bank, when they do a search in people's home. It's more aimed as destroying things and humiliating, and the bottom line is intimidating. And when people like the people who associated with the Filton campaign against LBIT, which is so instrumental, is so important to the Israeli tool and participate in the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, but not only in Gaza, also in the West Bank, and Jenin, etc. But they've been targeted into the most repressive. They actually even using a tactic which I know, like from how when I was campaigning for women, for Palestinian women prisoners, political prisoners, like to deny the family even knowing where, in which prison their family member is. They forbade them from speaking to each other. So if they go to any activity, whether it is the hour walk when they're allowed to be out of their cell, or any activity, if they go to a workshop, they're not allowed to communicate with others. But not only they're not allowed to communicate with other Filton, now 18, but they're not even allowed to speak to other political activists who are in prison, such as, and these are they're only on remand, they're not even convicted. It is outrageous. So they're not even allowed to speak for people who are environmental activists. it is so oppressive, and they deny, like a pile of letters waiting for one of the prisoners. They're not allowing her to see any of the letters. They're oppressive. And like a woman who is a practicing Muslim, and they just enter her room without giving her time to cover herself, and then abusively saying to her, "Oh, you don't need to bother covering because we walk into your room." And it's really intended to be humiliation, destruction of the strength of the person. For me, it is a kind of terrorism.
Well, this is very shocking. I mean, even for seasoned journalists, I mean, we've seen everything, but the way that these governments sound like they're operating, you know, if what you're saying is absolutely spot on, and I've got every evidence to suggest it is, then sounds more like we're living in a dictatorship, some kind of repressive, banana republic where actually there's no law and order. But at the same time, the same governments that you're saying now are doing this go around the world regularly telling other nations off for their human rights records. So I also found what you mentioned. I want you to expand on this if you possibly can. I began with the thought of protesters and people who are protesting tyranny and injustice. And that's bad enough that they're being harassed and restricted. But this idea that actually people can also be intimidated, not just legislatively or by the law and the police, but also by their workplaces. So that if you say something now which is towards the support of the oppressed, it could come on your Facebook, on your social media, and that could be reported. It could go to your workplace, and that could actually affect your own income. You could have your job taken away from you. And are there cases that you've come across? Because I have on this line, and now that you've kind of obviously raised it. How is this playing out in the movement for justice in general? Is it scaring people? Is it preventing them from saying things, and are they self-censoring?
Well, the doxing is very organized practice, which they really go to any protest and demand and get the photos of people, and then they publicly not just humiliate them, but actually act, especially with UK Lawyers for Israel in the background, facilitating it. And then, people are losing their job. People have lost their job. And so while the committed activists are not deterred, I have met people who are now scared to speak out. Yes, well, they're saying actually there is a person in my neighborhood of completely supporting the Palestinian, very dedicated to that, but he says, I have a family to support, I can't afford to speak out.
Well, Dr. Rehana Ali is somebody I met recently who is hopefully going to appear on our shows, and she's a case in point. Certainly, her medical board, her profession, are now looking into her competence and questioning her, presumably for anti-Semitism. Yet, what's fascinating is an article she sent me just last night was shocking in terms of its hypocrisy, because she pointed out somebody in the University College London, I think it's Dr. or Professor Katz, who has very openly said and done things which are extraordinarily, I think I would argue racist and Islamophobic perhaps, and yet there doesn't seem to be any action there. So there's also this notion that there is a picking and choosing. There's a cherry picking of who needs to be targeted with anti-Semitism or with other means of silencing them. And that's a very worrying trend for a democracy, I think. And I'm going to bring in Barry now at this stage. Barry, you've been in the world of the legal aspect of things, and you've been watching how legislation has increasingly become tightened. Give us your take, first of all, just maybe a background on how we've got to a state now where we are powerless when these kinds of ordinary citizens are expressing their support and solidarity for people who are downtrodden or treated unjustly, and yet they then find themselves in the docks, in front of the courts, and intimidated by police. How have we come to this?
Well, if I can start by saying this, I don't think it's a matter of we've somehow suddenly ended up here, so much as the fact that we are, with recent developments in communications technology, at last widely aware of this. I don't think it's ever really been any different. Certainly when people were protesting the Vietnam War in the 60s, there were all manner of excesses carried out against them. And as a general rule, protesting has only been tolerated insofar as it affirms an official establishment agenda. But the moment it becomes critical of an establishment agenda, let alone one being promoted by the security apparatus, then the question arises, are these people finding their human rights violated, both by protesting and, of course, the day-to-day administration of any bureaucrat's job, the way they carry out their job, the decisions they make, and even in the private sector, as Yael pointed out. And unfortunately, this myth that we've all held on to for a long time, that we've somehow, until recently, embraced something called the rule of law, was always just that, a myth. There has never really been a rule of law, and there's no such thing as an international rules-based order. We all ought to be perfectly aware of that by now. So this is all a fantasy, with the system actually being driven by power and hypocrisy and usually special interests. So the starting point is there. It's not so much that things have changed, as that they're now more readily seen. And for example, the Churchill government openly wrote in what was originally classified documents during World War II that they were themselves pursuing tactics that could be considered terrorism, like carpet bombing civilians and the like, and that they needed to stop doing that. In one document, Churchill wrote this, before the end of the war, they could be held to account afterwards. So none of this is new. As for this presumed right to protest that many people take for granted, or for that matter, the right to freedom of speech, these rights are somewhat nebulous at best, even in countries that have a constitutionally enshrined Bill of Rights, like, for example, the United States and Canada do. The UK doesn't. The UK doesn't even have a codified constitution. And what they like to refer to as the Constitution really has just been cobbled together from historical documents and judicial decisions over a period of many, many centuries. In fact, going back to 1066, and of course, anything given by the judiciary can just as easily be taken away. And then when we juxtapose that with the fact that there is now this concern, supposedly, with national security and terrorism, but national security not being anything that we used to think of it as, so much as securing the competitive advantage in the economy of, say, in this instance, British-based companies and the UK economy. When we couple it with that, the authorities, starting with the lowest level of police up to the ministerial level, and almost everybody except the legislative branch, are given through ever more acts of legislation the power to regulate, restrict, criminalize all manner of things that we took for granted to be freedom of speech, freedom of association and protest, and the right not to be discriminated against.
Barry, the thing that strikes me about what you say is, first of all, contextually, you're saying that not much has shifted, but you also do list several acts which have been put into place since 2000, and I want to kind of focus on how this links perhaps to the post 9/11 environment, because surveillance capitalism and the idea of more control and the idea of being able to get away with literally murder has been witnessed by the Muslim world. I mean, I'm picking on the Muslim world specifically because I note that Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Iran and Iraq, you know, the list is endless, Yemen, of course, and Palestine. These are all the primary areas, Syria, I forgot to mention, in amongst that. You know, there's been a methodical decimation of all Muslim nations which showed any kind of desire for independence, sovereignty, and keeping out of the global system. So, I mean, there could be an argument made that these draconian laws around terrorism have been instrumental in upping the level of power that police and the security apparatus has, and it's been done deliberately. And almost these wars have, or this idea of terrorism, the notion of terrorism and Islamist terrorism, has given them a lot of power to do that. What do you think of that theory?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly, and I would observe that the real terrorism throughout that period has in fact been mostly carried out by the Atlantic World Security apparatus led by the United States, who've quietly financed and trained and armed up all manner of extremist groups, and then publicly claimed to be opposing and fighting them. If we go back even a little bit further, it was only in 1990 that the post-war operation known as Operation Gladio was brought to a screeching halt. So for 50-odd years, we had basically all Western governments and their security agencies conspiring with the CIA and NATO to carry out all manner of false flag and criminal and terrorist operations against their own people in order to put up a front, a bulwark against any left-leaning political policies getting any traction, and in order to justify ever-expanding, ever-increasing police powers. Then when we look at what's happened since 9/11, there's been at least a dozen pieces of legislation enacted in the UK, culminating most recently in the Police Act in 2022 and the Public Order Act in 2023, which give a free hand basically to police on the beat right up to the appropriate minister to impose all kinds of restrictions on protests, the effect of which is essentially to mean that whatever you are permitted to do is not in any way a protest. You have to give notice of your intention to hold one. You have to indicate the route if it's not a static protest, the route it's going to take. You have to follow instructions on that. They can restrict the numbers that are involved. They can criminalize people for blocking traffic or in any way interfering with the activities of the community, which of course is half of what, like striking, protest is all about. They can criminalize you for causing damage to public property just for using chalk on the sidewalk, or,
okay, Barry,
or
I'm going to hold
some
you.
insignia or flag that they claim shows that you support a terrorist group, and the list goes on forever.
So I'm going to hold you there, Barry, because Yael has been on that front line, and you've heard Barry outline how the police have been given powers. But Yael, you've felt this in your own protest. Tell us a little bit about how the police have behaved when you've been out with various banners. I've seen you with a potentially controversial banner which talks about Nazism and such things. How were you treated? How were you received? And what can you relate to from what Barry said there in terms of how you're restricted?
Well, we all are being restricted, heavily restricted. I've been to a few court cases of Palestine action, and the judges were saying very clearly that actually there is no legal right for us to do any protest. Whatever we do, even if we don't do, we just planning to do, everything is illegal. And that's why activists, when they go to court, they prefer to have a jury, because at least the jury has the right to ignore the law and rule by their conscience. And indeed, they have cleared and found not guilty activists after the judge said that there is no legal protection to any. Because it used to be that activists used to, like, for example, destroy aeroplanes, a military plane, and they got cleared not guilty on the basis that they tried to stop a greater crime. But we don't have that protection anymore. They removed that. They changed the law in such a way that nothing, that the police, last year, the police tried to arrest me when I protested against the Chabad. Chabad is a fundamentalist Zionist group who's called Netanyahu, the rabbi called Netanyahu to bomb Shifa Hospital. It's an organization that participates in the illegal settlement. They've already been to Syria, calling to create illegal settlements there. And they've already done in Gaza illegal settlement, a Chabad house, and the police just invented it. I was on my own, just having my poster and leafleting, and the police tried to stop me. 2 days ago, again there was the Chabad event where I live, and I protested again, but they were a bit more actually. Did not threaten me with arrest, but then I made sure this time I had people who were filming me all the time, so that the police were not in a situation where they feel that they can intimidate me with arrest. But they just pull a lot, like rabbit from anything, anytime. They just like, no, you're not allowed to do that. People were doing carols in a centre of London, where actually had to stop in the middle of doing the carols, and even the minister who was doing her blessing, they tried to stop her in the middle with all the threat of arrest. So the police are being very, very aggressive towards us.
Well, in their defence, to play devil's advocate. Very hard for me, but I'll try. Let's say that law and order has to be maintained. They're going to say you're upsetting the peace, the harmony. I mean, even noise levels of protests apparently have got restrictions now. You can't make a certain amount of noise because it's going to disturb the neighbourhood. So there's also the notion that you could become racist by doing these things, being anti-Semitic. I mean, I appreciate you're an Israeli, you're a Jew, but you could be termed anti-Semitic for putting certain posters up. I would have thought. What's your take on these kinds of restrictions of, I guess, pinning people on the basis of these other aspects, racism and anti-Semitism and all of these other tools that can be used by the courts and the police to silence you. What's your take on all this kind of business?
Well, from everything that has already been said in this discussion, there is an extreme double standard. We completely, as people who are racist, express hate towards Palestinians. For example, I came to a protest, and I didn't hear it myself, but other activists heard it. A Zionist passed by and said, "Death to the Arabs." The police heard it and refused to take any action. But on the other hand, if we say any criticism, including myself, I was arrested as well, they just at the say-so of a Zionist with completely legitimate criticism of Israel, they say that the police immediately arrest these people, our side. In my case, I was already since January 2008, when I was last time managed to get into Gaza Strip, I went through Egypt, I concluded that Israel is going to do a genocide to Gaza. So since then, my life is completely dedicated to try to stop this genocide. So when immediately from the 7th of October, Israel started the genocide, I knew what it was about. So I was, I was so outraged. So I did a poster which expressed exactly what I feel, and I think it's very, very true. I called Israel Nazi. Israel is Nazi. Israel is Nazi and is acting.
Is that an opinion you're not allowed to have legally? I'm going to check with Barry. Why is that a problem? I'm wondering why you can't draw a comparison.
Well, they try. I'm not sure legally it is not allowed, because after 24 hours, which the police humiliated me and threatened me as much as they could, but then I was released and I was giving back the same poster I was arrested for.
So you weren't prosecuted for that?
No, I was not. And of course, I went and stood outside the same police station where they held me for 24 hours, put my poster back, and shouted, which also the police tried to stop us. I shouted from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Because at the beginning of the genocide, the police were actually telling people that we're not allowed to say that. The level of the compliance and serving the Zionist project is horrendous. And I wanted to go back to the issue of the double standard. We had the two people from the Foreign Office, which I believe working for MI6.
Just recently, yeah.
Yeah, recently, going to Syria, meeting an official terrorist, a real terrorist who was involved in head chopping of people and who really was involved in
Are we talking about Mr. Giuliani?
Yes.
Who now runs Syria, basically.
No, only part of it. And only part of it because obviously he enabled, because he always colluded with Israel. Israel always served ISIS, gave them logistics, gave them a weapon, and most important, they gave them medical treatment in the Golan Heights to ISIS. We're talking about ISIS, the terrorists, the real terrorists. Meanwhile, our people are being arrested under the terrorism legislation when there is absolutely zero terrorism. And moreover, while there was a 10 million bounty on Giuliani that for anybody who brings to his arrest, and also now the BBC also normalized him and glorified him. Meanwhile, people try to do something very simple, just a petition to the parliament that the legislation, it's not actually legislation, but the definition of Hamas as a terrorist organization, that it was actually done unlawfully. We were not, the people who initiated it were not even allowed. That petition was rejected, was not allowed to run by Parliament.
Well, we're not even allowed to say that word. H group is the word that I'm officially allowed to use for anybody who's proscribed as terrorists by the British government. Your point is absolutely spot on. I mean, I can't argue with that. I'm trying to find an argument against it. But why would a man who is the leader of Al-Qaeda at one stage, or a very prominent leader amongst the Al-Qaeda fraternity, then becomes the leader of HTS in Syria, but is still holding the same old Al-Qaeda viewpoints? Al-Qaeda, which is prescribed as a terrorist organization by all the same governments who we are citizens of here in the West, and yet now we're seeing that that's legitimized. So it does raise a question, Barry. This is an issue, isn't it? You have of course, I'll contextualize it with the ICJ and the ICC and what's been going on around huge debate about what's genocide and what's not genocide, what's a Holocaust and what's not a Holocaust. And it does come down to ultimately the exceptionalism that seems to be afforded to Israel in particular, that then influences legislation here in the West, which Yael has been talking about, and then the hypocrisy of the likes of known terrorists being now openly touted as allies and people that the British government can work with, yet ordinary British citizens are being labelled as terrorists or being persecuted as potential terrorists simply for protesting things which challenge the exceptionalism of Israel. Give us your overview, if you like, on this whole business of Israel and terrorism, and how we're being herded into labels, and how the legislature is, I guess, restricting our freedoms from that foreign policy perspective.
Well, I would go further. I would say the whole body of international punitive law that's ostensibly meant to stop nations from engaging in war crimes or supporting acts of terrorism is really just something that was conceived of to control countries in Africa, South America, and Asia, especially those countries that don't embrace the notion of global U.S. hegemony. And when it comes to exceptionalism, of course, Israel's not alone. The idea was championed, was invented by the Americans. And of course, almost all of Europe is actively involved in, along with the Americans, are involved in making this genocidal war possible by, for example, Germany providing arms, very large quantities of arms to Israel, and on it goes all the way up the line to merely running political interference. But to pick up what Yael was talking about earlier as well, of course, these powers that are given to even the lowest levels of police to make judgment calls and arrest people are not exercised without bias. So if we go back, for example, to the protests that erupted in American universities, I think it was the University of Southern California, ultimately pro-Palestinian protesters were criminalized and banned on the basis of some violent occurrences that took place. While it was completely ignored that there was very hard evidence about Zionist groups for days beforehand going in and provocatively engaging in violent acts against protesters who were ultimately defending themselves. So, you know, the whole thing is hypocritical. And of course, the way the law has been set up around the world, and the UK is no exception, is all of these laws that derogate from what we presume to be civil liberties don't require the state to prove that we were, that the police or whatever authority was exercising their power was wrong, or prove that we were wrong. It's enough that we don't follow instruction. So now, for example, the police, where there's a protest, they've been given wide powers to stop anybody in the area and search them and demand to see their ID for no reason without any corresponding suspicion. And then we had a Home Secretary who's now been replaced saying that anybody who has a Palestinian flag or who chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that they should be arrested and prosecuted for promoting hatred and supporting a terrorist group. Because, of course, there's this view that if you're Palestinian, you're a terrorist. That's what they say in Israel. You've had politicians ask, well, what about the babies? What about the women? Well, they're terrorists too. There are no innocents in Gaza. Merely exercising a vote in favor of the political branch of the H organization is deemed by them to be an act of terrorism. So it comes full circle when you see in countries like the United Kingdom, people being vilified, arrested. I don't know if there's been any successful prosecutions to date. They're also doing it in Germany, simply for carrying a Palestinian flag. Okay. And even though, if you ask them, the law says you can carry a flag, you can fly a flag on your own property too, unless, of course, the local council regulations prohibit it. And of course, they can do that. No doubt do that.
Now, the bigger question, of course, is the international law now says that Benjamin Netanyahu is a wanted criminal. I mean, I don't know to what extent he's been actually, or that's been passed. So there's no actual prosecution, but he's actually been, I think, asked to turn up to court. And he's also, there is also this question of whether Keir Starmer here in Britain or Donald Trump in America would actually do a citizen's arrest to take him to the ICC and ICJ. I mean, I'm being ridiculous, of course, we know the reality there. But on the one hand, you have this person, up for at least questioning around the case for genocide with Israel. But a lot of this is emanating from the draconian policies which Israel has implemented in Gaza and in Palestine for many, many years. You know, the apartheid, the evidence of apartheid, the segregation of Palestinian citizens, the second-class status of the Arab fraternity within Israel. I mean, all these things are facts. They're not conspiracy theories. But that kind of tone of how a so-called democracy, which is what Israel touts itself as, is almost like, arguably almost a disease which is now catching the West even more. They seem to like that style of how you run a democracy in Israel. And these laws that I'm seeing emerge in the West seem to move toward this capitalist or hyper-capitalist surveillance society. Facial recognition is on the way, digital currency is on the way, increasing monitoring of individuals, 15-minute cities. And if I start drawing the parallels with Gaza, I would be tempted to say that there's been quite a significant experiment about how you control society with a combination of legislation, police, security, surveillance cameras, digital robots, etc. Everything has been done, and of course missiles as well, bombs, and bombing people into submission. It's a very scary template if the West begins to follow Israel's example of how you run a democracy. What are your thoughts on some of those points that I've raised?
Well, I define Israel to be part of the West, part of the Atlantic world. It's an Atlantic world power, and it wields disproportionate power in the sense that if one were to consider the number of constituents that elect the prime minister in Israel, your average mayor in a middle-sized city and just about any other Atlantic world country has more votes. So it's peculiar that they have as much power as they do. And while we're talking about the use of technology, let's not forget that only 1 month before the incursion by the H organization and the subsequent military response from Israel, Netanyahu addressed the UN General Assembly and pronounced that the world was moving quickly to embrace artificial intelligence, and that Israel was leading the world, and that invited the whole world to follow Israel's lead on artificial intelligence. And we could be quite sure, as they seem to be very adept at doing, that they've managed in various ways to infiltrate and make sure that when it comes to using it in any military or other political application, artificial intelligence, that they're a part of the equation. That's not a world that I particularly want to be a part of, and I'm glad that I'm not a part of it. But that's the reality. As for the ICC arrest warrant for him, no, he hasn't been convicted of anything yet. But You don't have to be a legal scholar to understand that the term genocide is very clearly defined in international law. And what's being carried out is unquestionably a genocide. And that alone can be established by what the political apparatus and various members of the IDF have said throughout the relevant period about these operations. So there's no room to be confused about this. But no, he hasn't been arrested yet. And they're simply angry that with Israel having supported the appointment of the current chief prosecutor at the ICC, thinking he would be their man because he's certainly not ours, okay, that this could never happen. But I guess something happened to him in his own thinking or his inability to turn a blind eye. There was also some internal issues about allegations of a particular embarrassing kind against him that ultimately he had to follow the process through to where logically he needed to be, which was with a request for an arrest warrant, much as was done, albeit through a different court, for Milicevic in the former Yugoslavia and all the rest of it, who was prosecuted by a former mentor of mine as the chief prosecutor. So, the call is to arrest him, and no sooner than when the ICC, like the ICJ, got involved, the Americans and the Israelis and their various supporters and allies started threatening both the individuals and the institution responsible for that state of affairs. For example, in the ICJ case, the minister in South Africa who brought the case to the International Court of Justice, not to be confused with the International Criminal Court, had to deal with the fact that her family was threatened, she was threatened, all manner of horrible things were done. Yeah, well, and in any real world, if an alleged criminal does something like that, that in itself is even a far more serious criminal offense.
Okay, I'm going to bring
threatening
in
those people who are prosecuting you, but it's not when the Americans or the Israelis do it.
Right. Well, hypocrisy again. Wait, Yael.
In relation to actually implementing arrest warrant, our Prime Minister Starmer, when he was the head of the CBS, he sabotaged the arrest warrant that was against Israeli Tzipi Livni, who was the Foreign Secretary for Israel at the time of the 2008-2009 slaughter of Gaza, which shook many, many people. And by the way, there was massive arrest there, mainly targeting very young Muslim and giving them very long sentences, which already were showing. And that is also under the Starmer. So Starmer has been doing for a long time, so I wouldn't trust him to arrest
he was very famous for letting Jimmy Savile, the known paedophile, off the hook as well.
Yeah,
so
also MI6 and MI5 about torture. So no, he has been very much a tool.
Well, let me keep focusing on these individual cases and the hypocrisy of the law. I would have thought that the judiciary and the legal system, the Supreme Courts, all these guys, should act as a bulwark against the kind of legislation which Parliament and Congress and whatever else rolls out. So if there's excessive power, excessive anti-public legislation, you'd have thought somewhere along the line within a democratic system, the legal mechanism should kick in to protect us.
Sadly not, because as I said, I've been to many trials against Palestine Action activists who are amazing, absolutely amazing people. They are the best of us. And you can see many times that the judges going out of the way to assist the prosecution and to undermine the defense. For example, allowing evidence to be submitted after the trial already started, even when the legal process was 2 or 3 years. So there was plenty of time for the prosecution to submit. So they were clearly ambushing the activists, the defendant, so that they couldn't actually defend themselves. And it's been a practice, and there are lots of other practices where the prosecution make mistake, the evidence is clearly can be challenged, but you can tell that the whole system is geared.
Yael, one more point that I along this same line, Asa Winstanley from Electronic Intifada had his computers and his laptops taken with the forced effort by the police to tell him to give them all of his access points, his passwords, so they could access whatever was going on. We had, I think it was Sarah Wilkinson, who they've also been trying to force to take contact. And Sarah said something interesting at that time. She said that if I give them all my contact base, then this contact base has got all my Palestinian friends, all my activists in Gaza, in Palestine, and the police would have access to those. And if they had access to them, it's very possible that they would give them to Mossad and to the Israeli agencies, who would then use that information to locate those individuals on their WhatsApps, etc.
Asa was very explicit about it. He's struggling to stop the police and all the other forces that are accessing now his electronics from having his contact. Especially because he did publish in Electronic Intifada very important work which shows that Israel was actually involved in killing its own citizens on the 7th of October.
The Hannibal Doctrine.
The Hannibal Doctrine. But they wanted to know his contact, and he's struggling to stop that. So that's definitely. But since Starmer has been the Prime Minister, they've been really using, like he nominated as a Solicitor General a person from the JLM, the Jewish Labour Movement. It's not Jewish organization and it's not Labour. It's really apparatus of the Israeli Foreign Office. And she is the one in a position to decide who of us to arrest, who of us to invade our home and destruct our own home, and basically colonize some of the home for many days, when even other members who not suspect were not allowed to go back to their home, while their home was smashed by allegedly searching. And he put also as other people in power position, one who actually made the decision, officially the decision, to charge under terrorism the co-founder of Palestine Action, Richard Barnard, and for a speech he made under the Tories already a year ago. But it took Starmer to do that. Even the Tory didn't dare to do that, to charge him under terrorism. So it just and it was the people who Starmer nominated who actually signed it, who allowed that deterioration of any rights that any even imaginary or limited rights that we had. They're definitely increasing the oppression massively.
Well, we're running out of time now.
I like to add that the other side of the equation are the protesters. And the protesters are determined. And that's what really shocked the state. I have no doubt. They never expected that 14 and a half months on, people are still protesting, are still every day there is action in the UK, especially in London, a few actions in London every day. So, including today, people are not giving up. They're absolutely determined to continue the fight despite all the oppression. You can see that people are still taking action, not through Palestine Action, but all different. And there's a lot of organic organization. A lot of people are looking for lots of different ways, new ways of protesting and trying to stop the genocide, and also connecting it to other struggles. So we're not so easily going to be defeated.
Well, that sounds at least a ray of hope there, is that on the grassroots, people are still interested in their liberties. They will fight for their freedom. It's not going to be a complete pushover for the so-called Western democracies to force and bludgeon a liberal society into accepting draconian totalitarianism. That's a breath of fresh air, and I guess that's where our hope lies. It sounds to me like the establishment and the institutions have already wilted to the power of those who are in power and who want more power. The fact is, a democracy is meant to have checks and balances. The checks and balances ultimately seem to be very, very vulnerable and weak right now. The only real hope is that the public and the people themselves demand that those hard-fought rights and freedoms which have been won are not rolled back. Increasingly, this battle, I think, is going to be one which is going to sort of dictate just how our society evolves over the next few decades, and I think it's a fight worth fighting. And definitely, freedom and liberty are not things that we should give away lightly. Thank you for watching this edition of Deep Dive Perspective. Do press the like and share buttons, and do subscribe to the channel and spread the message far and wide. Thank you for watching.